mendelspod.com, advancing life science research, connecting people and ideas.
Welcome to Mendel's Pod. As we noted in a recent blog about patient involvement in the industry, there's a growing trend for patient disease foundations to get directly involved with drug development. Today we're at the offices of the Myelin Repair Foundation, which is a patient foundation with a new model for coming up with drugs for multiple sclerosis. And it's a model which perhaps could be used by others for coming up with cures for disease. Joining us is the founder and the president of the Myelin Repair Foundation, Scott Johnson.
Today's show is sponsored by Collaborative Drug Discovery, leading the paradigm shift in collaborative web-based drug discovery research. Archive, mine, and collaborate around your lab's data with a hosted CDD vault. Make drug discovery fun again.
So thanks for joining us, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Really appreciate that. It's great to be here today.
So, first of all, your foundation is not even named after the disease that you're working on. What's the story there?
Well, our name is the Myelin Repair Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because in multiple sclerosis, the damage in the disease is to the myelin, which is the insulation on your nerves in your central nervous system. And so our objective is not to reduce the immune response not to reduce the immune damage that comes with the disease, but to actually try and repair damage and restore function. And so since we're trying to repair the myelin, which is what's damaged, that's why we're called the Myelin Repair Foundation.
Mm-hmm. So
it is
more focused.
It's very focused. I mean, MS is a very complex disease, and has been, there's been research on that and work towards finding treatments for 60 plus years. And almost all the focus up until now has been on the immune response. And so our angle coming at this from a repairing of the damage is very different and very focused, as you said, very specific.
Tell us about you. So you were diagnosed with MS when you were 20 or so, and that hasn't slowed you down any. You've been a successful serial entrepreneur.
Yes, I was diagnosed when I was 20. I was still an undergraduate in college, and started experiencing symptoms, and actually, contrary to a lot of people with MS who it takes many, many years to get a diagnosis, my symptoms were very classic symptoms, and so I was actually diagnosed within a few months of my first symptom, and this was back in 1976, and at the time there were really no treatments whatsoever, and so my response, I think, really is, I actually got a second opinion at UCLA, and the doctor there simply said, well, we can't really do anything for you, so don't stress yourself emotionally or physically. See you later. And so, being a 20-year-old who'd been very active, that was advice that didn't seem to me that was very useful to me, and so I pretty much just ignored it. And so I have pursued a business career and been fortunate to be able to be successful at that and to keep moving. And I have lots of impacts of the disease, but I'm actually feel fortunate compared to many people with the disease, and so it really hasn't slowed me down, I would say.
So let's talk about the foundation. You're doing something new here.
Yes. I think we're doing everything new, is I guess how I would characterize it. The way we operate, what our objectives are, how we think, just everything about the foundation, I think, is different than your typical nonprofit medical research organization.
Okay, and why is that? I mean, let's talk
Well,
about what you're doing.
I think there's a couple things that are different. One is that I think it's interesting because virtually, I think everyone here actually comes out of a for-profit environment. So I think the mindset of all the employees and staff here is really more like, how do you run a startup company to be successful? And since I think that's probably driven by, that was my background in startup companies.
More
And
entrepreneurial.
So, right, and I didn't know better. I didn't know how nonprofits worked. I just thought, well, let's run this like a business, even though we are a nonprofit. And I think that spirit in terms of how we think is is true throughout the organization, that we just really think, how do we solve problems and move forward. And so, yeah, we are a nonprofit but operate like a for-profit.
And so the goal here, I mean, you're looking at the complete path with drug development.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that sets us apart is that, as I mentioned, first, we operate like a business in a way, even though we're not profit. But I think key is one thing that when I looked at the way medical research was done, for me, I was coming at this with fresh eyes. This was back in about 2001, and I had never really thought about how medical research was conducted, how the different entities, intermixed and worked together or didn't work together. And I also didn't know anything about academic research, so I kind of came at this with a complete clean slate. And so what struck me is that there were many different players in that continuum. There's, depending on how you define it, there's probably 20 or 30 steps to get from, making basic discoveries to getting something approved into patients. And it's a many-year process. People would say probably 30 to 50-year process. And you've got the...
You mean developing therapies for a disease?
Yes, to go all the way from making doing the basic discovery biology to making those discoveries and validating them and doing drug discovery and doing clinical trials and getting approval. It's an extremely lengthy process.
And that didn't intimidate you as an entrepreneur and someone who hadn't been in the industry?
Well, it wasn't about intimidating. That to me was the opportunity. Because really it was, here you have a huge problem. This is a really lengthy process that's far too long.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you find ways to change that, to speed it up? And one of the things that struck me was that you had all these different participants in that value chain. You've got the academic researchers doing the discovery biology. You've got the NIH, which funds a large portion of that academic research. You've got nonprofits who are involved. You've got biotechs. You've got VCs. You've got pharma. You've got patients. You've got clinicians. You've got the FDA. So all these different participants or players, you might say, in that value chain, and not one of them really thinks about that entire continuum. And think about it if you were trying to make an automobile and you didn't have anyone who, and you had the design folks and you had the manufacturing folks and you had the marketing folks and on all these different, and the government approval people and all those different participants. If there was no one that actually thought, okay, how are we actually going to get this thing from beginning to end and actually get it to consumers?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what auto companies do. But there's no equivalent in the healthcare area. And so what struck me is the key, I think, fundamental difference, I think, in how we approach this is we try and think strategically about that entire continuum. How can we get each of the different participants to maybe behave slightly different, slightly more collaboratively, or slightly more interactive with the other participants, so that we can figure out ways to coordinate across the value chain and take time out of each of the steps. So that's really our objective, is how do we help each of the participants perform better? How can we add value to each or incent them to behave slightly differently so that we can move the entire process and shorten it, move it faster. So I think that idea of thinking about the entire continuum and being involved and trying to think about how do we impact every step in the process.
So how are you impacting the steps with first the science, the research, and through the process?
Yeah, we, I think, have had a huge impact already. And so basically what I would call at the front end, which is the discovery biology side, we focused there initially because Myelin Repair, as I mentioned, was an area that really had no focus until we came along. And so there wasn't a big base to build on. And there weren't any companies interested in it at the time. And so we knew we had to move the discovery biology forward rapidly.
Why weren't companies involved in it or interested? Does that have to do with the market, or?
No. Actually, I think the market. One thing that we're fortunate about is that MS is not a rare disease. It's probably the most common neurological disease there is in the developed world, and it is for the drugs that are available. It's a good sized market. So it's not about market potential. It's that until, within the last decade or so, people didn't believe that there was the possibility of repair in the central nervous system. There was a belief that for some reason the central nervous system, unlike most cells in your body, was relatively static, that there wasn't a turnover in cells, and that there wasn't kind of a replenishment of myelin going on in healthy people. And that it wasn't until, I'd say, the late 90s that people began to talk about the brain as plastic. The fact that, if you had certain kind of injuries, other parts of the brain would compensate. So clearly there was some rewiring going on. And that if you learn to play an instrument or learn a new language in your 50s or 60s, they can actually, know that new neuronal connections are forming. So if that's true, then there's more myelin forming. And so I think that as that realization came through, that the brain was more plastic than anyone had thought, then that opens the door for the fact that maybe repair is possible. And I think before we came on, people weren't really thinking that. I think we brought a lot of attention to that, and so it wasn't really viewed as therapeutically relevant. Myelin repair wasn't viewed as therapeutically relevant, I think, until we came along. So our initial objective with the discovery biology was to make enough discoveries and have enough proof points that industry would begin to see it as an area they should be interested in. And again, our thinking is that, funding academic research is great, and it produces a lot of papers. But from our perspective, that wasn't the measure of success. The measure of success from our perspective for the discovery biology was, are companies now interested in this? Because obviously only companies are going to be the people who can do the drug discovery and do the clinical trials. So if companies aren't interested, then you haven't gotten anywhere. So that was really our first measure of success back in 2004 when we began to fund the discovery biology. Our goal was that within 5 years there would be company interest in myelin repair.
Now you have a relationship with 4 universities, investigators at 4 universities, right?
We actually have relationships with 7 different universities and the NIH. We're funding 8 labs actually. We have what we call, we distinguish, we have what we call core labs, where we have very large efforts, and what we call sponsored research labs. So we have 4 core labs and then 4 sponsored research labs.
And because you're overseeing it, these researchers are collaborating more than they might.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a true collaboration with a great deal of interaction and coordination. And also, I think one thing that sets it apart as a collaboration is that we have clear goals and metrics, which I think is pretty unusual for an academic collaboration. Most academic collaborations, and it's a very popular word today, is to say that academics are collaborating because it helps raise funds. I'd say that's why it's a well-used word. But often usually I should say, it's simply a group of academics that might say, let's share reagents, or let's compare results at the end of the year or every couple of years or whatever. What's very different about ours is that it is a group that has shared the thinking about what the research plan should look like, that has shared the thinking about what experiments should be done first and prioritizing those, and that actually compares data as it comes out as opposed to when a paper gets published or pretty far down the road. So in effect, these 8 labs are one virtual lab. I mean, it's that degree of interaction. Usually things in a typical principal investigator's lab, they would have lab meetings where information is shared within that lab, but would never be shared outside of the lab until something was published or presented at a conference. And it's very different in ours, is that what would be shared only within one lab meeting at a university is now shared across the 8 labs and also with our staff. I mean, we have over 100 years of pharma experience on our staff here at the foundation. And so we now have a team of, and then if you actually fold in our advisors, which are not window dressing, but are people who are very actively involved in the process and spend, I'd say on average, about 7 full days a year, these advisory board members.
You have quite a hefty 3 advisory boards.
We have 3 advisory boards, and so among all of those scientists, you're talking about probably 70 scientists involved. So it's a pretty beefy effort. I mean, it's by an order of magnitude larger than any company has. has than any other organization in the world has that's even thinking about myelin repair now.
How did you incent the researchers to share early, to collaborate?
That's a really good question, because it didn't happen easily. As one of the principal investigators said to me, he said, as a young student, or even maybe as an early postdoc, your natural inclination is to share, but he said that gets beat out of you pretty quickly. He said you learn that you need to make sure that you protect your ideas and you get credit for your work, because that's the way you're going to be able to get published and get grants and get your own lab, etc. And so we had to kind of almost, it took us a while to build that trust among the team where there would be complete sharing. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget, it was about a year or so into it where we had one of our meetings where we had our scientists together, and one of the PIs blurted out.
So they do come together from the different into one place?
Yes, we get them together 3 times a year for several days each. So there's a lot of in-person interaction, face-to-face. There's also, we have monthly, regular scheduled conference calls where they're all on the line. And we also are in constant email contact. And then we have one of our staff members out in the labs probably several times a year, speaking to the students and postdocs. So it's a very large amount of interaction among the scientists in academia as well as with our scientists. Right. But what I was going to say is that at one of these meetings, one of the PIs blurted out some results that had just literally come out the day before, and he just put his hand on, I shouldn't have said that. And then he realized, no, it is safe. And so that was, I think from that minute on, there was kind of nothing was ever held back. I think even up till that point, which was probably about a year into it, I think people probably had maybe at least held back maybe some of the most recent stuff in the last week or month might have been kind of held back. But after that, it was very clear that everything was being shared literally in real time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, Big Pharma is establishing relationships with different universities now. They're realizing that they may do better if they start collaborating with each other, right? And you were able to come up with some kind of a relationship that would open that up.
Yeah, and I think that I don't think it's changed, but when we started, all of our PIs were pretty skeptical of pharma, and kind of felt like somehow interacting with pharma in a major way would somehow taint them or somehow influence their academic freedom. And so I think some of those efforts where companies are going to are reaching out and trying to fund academics directly, I'm not sure how productive those will be. I hope they are. But I think one thing we found is that there's a true benefit of being a nonprofit, because the academics view us as safe or neutral, not the corporate, folks they kind of think of. And so it allowed us, I think, initially to pull the team together much more effectively and work with them in a way that I think is really hard for a company to go and do directly. I mean, companies sometimes will fund an individual scientist to do a specific experiment or something like that. But I think the degree of interaction and the depth of dialogue and the trust that we built up, I think would be really hard for a company to do that. And I think that's where we feel that's one of the things that's too bad about nonprofits until now, is that they've mostly acted like a mini NIH. I mean, most disease organizations
just fund and they stand back.
Yeah, they basically, just like the NIH, put out a request for proposals. They get the proposals in. They pull together a peer review committee. They peer review those. They then give the funds, and their expectation, if it goes well, is that a paper will result. And I kind of think of that as fund and forget. That you kind of spend all this effort up front, picking the work you're going to fund, and there's not a lot of interaction after that. And ours is very different. We spent a lot of time selecting the team we wanted to fund. We wanted to find the best of the best in each of the areas of expertise to solve myelin repair, and then we work very closely with them and give them the funds and then interact with them on a daily basis, basically, because we want to ensure that work gets us to where we want to go.
So is there a shift in their thinking from discoveries just for the sake of science or for a nice publication towards therapeutics?
Absolutely, and that's actually the perfect question, because when we came along, these were all brilliant scientists publishing at they're great universities, big labs, lots of grant money, and virtually none of them were the thought of whether an experiment was therapeutically relevant, as one of them said to me, never crossed my mind. He said, I'm trying to answer basic scientific questions. And he also said, I assumed, because since I had no knowledge of the pharma industry, because I didn't want to be tainted by them, I assumed that when I made this basic discovery, it was going to magically turn into a treatment. I had no idea that there were another 20 or 30 steps in the process to actually get it to the finish line. And
as an entrepreneur, you must have been stunned by that.
I was, and that's actually why I founded the Myelin Repair Foundation, because I assumed for the first 25 years that I had multiple sclerosis that the way that there was a collaborative effort, that scientists, academics were working closely together, and that there was somebody coordinating the entire value chain, and that someone had a research plan, and that people were thinking about, how are we going to get things actually to patients. And when I learned how the process currently operates, that's what caused me to think, well, boy, this is an area that's ripe to be fixed, and where you can take a lot of time out of this. And I never envisioned, if you would ask me now, 15 years ago, are you going to be involved with that kind of research, or a nonprofit, or trying to find a cure for a disease, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean, it was not on my radar screen of something I just assumed it was already being done and didn't need to be done. So it wasn't until I learned about how the system currently worked that I thought, well, that can be fixed. Let's just go into this, and let's do this in a different way, and show that by doing it in this new way, you can take 50+% of the time out of the process.
The other place that you're being innovative is what's called the translational gap. So getting it from, after the discoveries are made, from the science and research phase, into drug development, and then into clinical trials.
Yep.
So they call that the Valley of Death.
Yep.
What are you doing there that's different?
Well, again, this will show my naivete and how little I knew about this. So we started funding the basic science. We got this collaboration working terrifically well. I started producing really great results. So we started going out to pharma companies and saying, look at our results, and this is great stuff. We're ready to hand it over to you, basically. And we pretty much got blank stares from the companies, and we couldn't figure that out. Why aren't they interested in these great discoveries we've made?
They thought it was still too high risk.
Exactly. And so what we did to try and understand this disconnect or this problem was we went to the Boston Consulting Group, which is where I worked initially in my career, and we said, look, we don't understand why they're not interested. So as part of a pro bono study they did for us, they convened 2 workshops. One that was hosted at Harvard Business School, and one that was hosted on the West Coast here at U.S. Venture Partners. And at those, they invited senior pharmaceutical folks to those meetings. And so we posed the question, why aren't you interested in the basic discoveries that are made in academia? And what they said was very interesting. They said, no one's ever asked us that question. And so they said the reason is that obviously for any of our internal programs, we maintain a data package which covers 10 or 12 different areas depending on the company, and we're continually updating that, and that's how we determine if we continue to fund it. So they said, if you can show us a data package like that for your discoveries, then we could make an intelligent decision as to whether what you were showing us was worth licensing.
And what does that data package need to show?
It needs to show a whole bunch of different areas. So what I'll say is that what we did is we said, okay, just like what we did at the front end, where we said, what expertise do we need to solve myelin repair? We said to the companies, let's assemble an advisory board that is knowledgeable in those 10 or 12 different areas, whether it's PK-ADME or whatever, and then that advisory board can help us assess the discoveries that have been made for their therapeutic benefit and tell us what data we need to flesh out that data package. And so that is how we began to think about crossing the Valley of Death. And so as part of that process, what we did is we assembled something we call our translational medicine platform, which is really a set of assays and tools that we can use to take targets and compounds and evaluate them and determine which ones, and do it in an efficient and low-cost manner to find out which ones will have the best potential of making it through clinical trials. And I think of that translational medicine platform, or our TMP as we call it, as almost like an engine that we can feed in as many targets as possible, and then the output at the other end will be data on which ones we think are best to move forward, and then we can show that data to companies, and so that we can then license it to companies. Also, this translational medicine platform can be something where companies can come to us to run their compounds through. Because one thing we've done is we've invested over the last 5 or 6 years in assay development in our academic labs that are very good at evaluating myelin repair, and often better than anything that industry has. So even just recently, we've had several companies come to us saying, we've got some compounds that we think have myelin repair potential, but we'd like to have you run them through your assays and
like
give us the data.
with the Endosine?
Endosine, right.
Uh-huh.
That was one company that had come to us recently, and so we're actually just now, I think, beginning to run their compounds through. Actually, we should have results within a week, come to think of it.
So you began in 2001?
We had the idea in 2001,
Mm-hmm.
and then spent the first couple of years just trying to understand the landscape and begin to put the pieces in place.
Mm-hmm.
We had to figure out, what kind of expertise we would need, who the best people were. We had to put in place the research plan. We also negotiated agreements with the universities so that we could make sure that the IP would be protected and be licensable. And then we also had to put in place some infrastructure. So just like you would in a typical Silicon Valley startup, the first thing we did back in, I guess it was about early 03, is we went out to raise some seed money.
Mm-hmm.
So we raised about $170,000 worth of seed money that allowed us to put all those pieces in place. And then once we had the research plan put together and had a budget for achieving our first 5-year goal, we estimated it would cost us about $25 million to do that. So in early 04, we set out to raise $25 million. And once we had at least $1 million, we began funding research. And so we first funded research in summer of 2004.
2004.
Yeah.
So now it's 2012.
Yes.
How are things going?
I think they've gone farther and faster than anyone ever expected, outside the organization or inside, to be honest. The discovery biology effort has been terrific, has produced many targets. The assays that we've developed and some of the animal models we've built are exceptional in terms of being able to help guide us in myelin repair. And the translational medicine platform is something that is coming together very well. And the fact that we have companies interested, to us, it just tells us that we're going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
That there are now many companies interested in myelin repair and view it, like I said, as the next generation of MS treatment, and really as the area that most investment will probably come into, because the bar for immune suppression is actually now pretty high. And so if you want to come up with something that's going to be truly different, you really need to be thinking about myelin repair. And so we feel really good about that. So I think in terms of progress on the myelin repair, it's excellent. And I think we've also are recognized as a leader in the space, as a thought leader, and that the model is unique and different. And so we've gotten a lot of attention for the model alone.
When did the light go off for you? I mean, you've been an entrepreneur. You were going from business to business. One of them's an entertainment business you were working in.
Yeah.
But you had MS, and I guess you were following it in the news.
Well,
What
sure.
happened?
So I think that there was a trigger. I mean, literally, I was just reading Business Week, like I probably do most weeks, and in every issue, at least I think there still is, but this is 2001. They had what they called news briefs, which were simply one-paragraph stories on interesting things, and one mentioned repair and MS. And it caught my eye because I'd never seen those two things together. And so there was a scientist at Yale that was mentioned, and so having been a consultant in the past and used to kind of just going out and gathering information, I just picked up the phone and contacted him, and asked him a whole bunch of questions, and he suggested other scientists that I should talk to. And so just in my spare time, I mean, I was just asking a question, basically. This was not, I had no thinking that I was going to go off in some new direction. So I just spoke to a whole bunch of scientists over time, and there were two things that seemed to come out very clearly. One, that myelin repair seemed like a doable objective, that you could accomplish that there was very little attention had been come to it to date, and so it seemed to me if you could bring some focus to that, you could dramatically increase the rate that a treatment could possibly come out that would repair myelin. But actually, and that was having had MS for 25 years at that point. That was a really interesting revelation. But the second thing that came out of all these conversations was almost more interesting, and that was about learning about this system of medical research that just struck me as completely, it's a pretty strong word, but I'd say dysfunctional. And it just seemed to me that it could be greatly accelerated. And so that's really what I set out to do, was to figure out. So from the beginning, we've had two goals. I mean, literally, if you look at our strategic plan that we put together back in 2003, the first goal is to get a myelin repair treatment to patients within 15 years. And the second was to, in doing so, demonstrate a model that would be so clearly superior that it would become the new standard for the way all medical research would get done.
So you were intrigued on two levels, really.
Absolutely.
Your disease,
yes,
and curing it, but also just from a business perspective, from someone who thinks systematic, we could actually do something different here.
Yeah, I mean, because you'd say a business perspective, we're a nonprofit, obviously.
Yeah,
but
you keep sounding very kind of entrepreneurial,
right?
Looking at the whole process and making for sure you get results.
Absolutely, and what struck me is, if you think about it, my mindset at the time, I'd had MS for 25 years, which is a pretty debilitating disease. There's a lot of other bad diseases that there aren't cures. As most people know, there's very few diseases that actually have cures, and there are thousands of diseases. So you might say it's a target-rich environment in terms of there's in terms of a problem that needs to be solved. And so the idea that you could maybe come up with an entirely a new way that could be used for all disease research. I mean, that's a pretty audacious goal, but also has just huge impact. I mean, literally, if you can do that, you're going to impact the lives of everyone on the planet, basically. You can't get too much bigger than that in terms of implications for doing something meaningful. So, yeah, those two things really struck me as interesting, and the fact that it seemed like a no-brainer. I mean, it's probably the typical entrepreneur thinks that, let's just do this.
Yeah, because you have a well-established industry, big players. One would think, am I getting something wrong? Or
well,
at some point you stood up and said, no, I'm not getting it wrong. It really is dysfunctional.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I maybe it was naivete, but it was also, I think, that it was that fresh look. It was the fact that I didn't have a background in this, or either healthcare or in academia, that it just struck me that these things were just so common sense. Instead of seeing why they wouldn't work, I just assumed, well, of course they'll work, and so just kind of plunged ahead. And I think we've been really fortunate from the beginning is that the idea really resonated with a lot of people, because I think people may not have put their finger on the idea that the system is just not, that it is dysfunctional, but I think most people know deep down it's just not working as well as they'd like, anyone in the industry. And so I think anyone that then saw what we're doing said, well, yeah, your idea makes sense, and so it's been great because it's drawn really great people.
There was a hungry audience.
Yes. And so I think if you look at the people involved with our organization, as whether they're advisors or board members or people on the team, it's an outsized set of talent for an organization as small as we are. And I think the reason that is because the idea and the goals of the organization have just drawn people who really are passionate about the industry and want to help figure out solutions. And they see what we're doing as the best possible fix for something they've devoted their whole lives to.
Was there a moment, though, that stands out when you went from interest and accumulating interest to, I could do this, I could change this?
Yeah, I suppose so. So one of the first things that we did was, again, I knew nothing about this. So one of the first things I did is I just got a few friends together and people that either had a tie to MS or knew me, and we formed what we call our business advisory board. And so I would dig around for information, and then this group would convene about every 6 weeks, and I'd tell them everything I'd learned, and they'd make suggestions. Well, at the very first one of those meetings, I mentioned that I'd come across on doing an internet search of something that there was going to be a Gordon conference on myelin. And I had no idea what a Gordon conference was, but one of the people at this meeting absolutely did know what Gordon conferences were. It says, you've got to get to that meeting no matter what. And so I said, okay. And it turns out Gordon conferences are convened on very specific topics like myelin, and they're usually held only every several years, and they're by invitation only. So I contacted the woman who was chairing it for that session, and said I'd like to come. And she said, well, you don't have a PhD, and it's invitation only, so no. And I kind of explained what I was trying to do, and she was intrigued enough that she said, well, you know what, they give me 2 extra slots, so I'll just let you have one of those. And it turns out that the Myelin Conference is only held in the United States every 4 years. And it just happened to be the month after that we'd had this business advisory board meeting where this person said, you gotta go. And so it was being held in Ventura, and so I went down and I listened to the sessions. It was about 4 or 5 days long, and listened to a lot of scientists and spoke to them in the halls. And over meals, I just kind of explained that I had this concept of getting a group of scientists to work collaboratively and to work with them to put together a research plan. And I would have expected that they would have just said, you're crazy, but actually they were very receptive. And so I think that's when I began to think that it would make sense to do this, and that we could get a team together to work in the fashion we were thinking.
Is this the better model for the future?
I think it's the best model, and I think that it's critical that we change from the way we're doing it now, because the system, I would say, is failing all of us. All of us are going to need treatments. Whether we have a disease right now or have a family member with a disease right now, you're going to come down with macular degeneration or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something. And unfortunately, the current system probably isn't going to have a treatment there when you need it. So to me, we need to do better. And so I think the way we're doing it is the best way that's available now. We are perceived as a thought leader, and that we're a pioneer in the space. So I do think the Accelerated Research Collaboration Model, or ARC model as we call it, is the most effective way to speed up basic science.
Accelerated Research
Collaboration. Yeah, the ARC model. And that this idea of having a translational medicine platform in place to bridge the valley of death is absolutely critical, and is something that really can be replicated by all disease organizations. And then the whole concept of forming partnerships with companies to actually move some of these targets forward, and have the academics be there and available to interact with pharma is also a critical piece of making sure that things move through the entire chain.
Mm-hmm.
I think this idea of continuity and coordination of the entire value chain is critical, because if you think about it, if any one of those 20 or 30 steps, if the ball gets dropped in any one of those, you don't get a treatment. So it's absolutely essential that someone be thinking about making sure that you don't miss a step, and if something drops, that you figure out how to pick it up and keep it moving.
So that's your job with Myelin Repair, is you're watching that the ball doesn't get dropped. If it does, you go over and pick it up.
That's the exact analogy. That's correct. Our job is to make sure that things are always moving in the right direction, and looking for ways to speed things up, to help each of the entities do a better job, or to help and figure out how we can get resources to them, or get them anything they need that can speed things up. What we see ourselves as doing is adding value to all the participants, to incent them to behave slightly differently within the constraints of whatever their system is, and so that we get to speed things up.
We haven't talked much about the fact you're a nonprofit. I mean, we've talked about how entrepreneurial minded you've been. But the first seed money you raised, you were telling talking about the 25 million. This is all donation. I mean, it's fundraising that you're doing.
Absolutely. So there's 2 points I think are really key to your question. One is, I think that only a nonprofit can really galvanize academics to work as a true team in a collaborative fashion. I think that it's difficult for anyone else to do it. I think we have an advantage over the NIH, we have an advantage over companies. I think it's something that only a nonprofit can do. I also think this idea of maybe some things in the pre-competitive space with companies is something that only a nonprofit can do. I mean, nonprofits are kind of non-threatening. People view them like Switzerland in a way, kind of neutral. And I think what we try and do is use that neutrality in a way to help, these different entities kind of put their differences aside in a way. So yes, it's absolutely, we are a nonprofit, and I think it's absolutely essential that we be a nonprofit to do what we're doing. So as you said, we initially raised donation money for seed money, and then since then, we've raised about another almost $45 million, or over $45 million of donation money, and so it's very different from raising capital for a company.
For one thing, it puts you in touch with patients directly, right?
It does. Absolutely, we're in touch with patients. Although, what's interesting is half the money that we've raised to date has come from people who have no association with the disease, which I think is, I don't think that there's any other disease organization out there, any other nonprofit, that can say that. I'd say probably for most diseases, it's 99.9% of the funds they raise come from people who have a family member or have the disease themselves. And I think the fact that we've been able to raise literally 50% of our money from people who have no association with MS reflects that dual goals that we mentioned. The fact that we have 2 goals. One is getting Myelin Repair treatment on the market, but the other is to demonstrate this model. So half the money has come from people who really view this model as something that needs to be developed and demonstrated so that it can then be applied to all of the diseases. And they're passionate about the proving the model.
So you said you've raised $45 million. What's your next milestone? Do you need to raise more money to get to drugs to patients?
Yeah, so it's funny because I think a lot of organizations, especially nonprofits, measure themselves by how much money they raise or how much money they give out. And we're very careful to have milestones that are really driven around, how far, how many targets we're identifying, how many partnerships we're setting up. But to get there, we obviously have to raise money. And so we've identified that we need to raise about another $80 million to get us to our ultimate goal, to get us through 2019 and getting treatment to patients. And we've raised most of our money to date from individuals, some from companies, some from foundations, but probably 85 to 90% has come from individuals. And then these are folks who are passionate about either getting a treatment to patients or showing that this new model works. And I think that it's raising funds from individuals has been a difficult challenge for us in some ways, because most of the public, just like I assumed until 2001 or 2002, assumes that medical research is being conducted the way we're doing it. So we actually have an interesting challenge, because usually when we sit down with somebody, we first of all have to explain to them how the current system works, and then we explain what we're doing, and they go, well, of course that'll speed it up, because it's common sense. I mean, what really is almost embarrassing to me is that people say what we're doing is revolutionary, and I think, it's such common sense what we're doing, and it's such business 101, it's how you run a business, that it just is crazy to me in a way that it's considered so revolutionary. But it's just because the system has evolved, I would say, over the last 50 or 60 years to where it is now, in terms of the fact that academics are pretty isolated from pharma and don't understand what pharma really needs and what pharma does. And yet, I think it's critical that those two entities interact heavily if you're going to really make inroads on this, solving this problem, because most of the basic science is done in academia, and yet all drug development and clinical trials are done in pharma. So there's no way that you can just expect something that's discovered in academia to just somehow get across the finish line unless you have those groups talking together, and I think that's critical.
And 125 million, I mean, it's 45 plus the 80 that you're raising next is not that much when you look at how much
Right.
the industry works with for a drug. I mean, the number's around $4 or $5 billion, people think.
Right.
per
It's
drug.
exactly right. If you think about it, that's basically 125 million over 15 years, which at an annual rate is relatively low. And if you compare that with the fact that it's about $140 billion a year is spent on medical research between the academic side and pharma. So $140 billion a year, and if you're thinking 125 over 15 years, it's a drop in the bucket. And I think what's been amazing is the power of the funds we've raised, because it really, we've been extremely cost effective with every dollar that we spend. Again, because we're pioneering this model, we've had an amazing degree of pro bono support. Wilson Sonsini, the law firm here in Silicon Valley, has done our legal work pro bono. And I think that they never expected when that started that it would top $1.2 million, but they've been very generous because we've had a lot of IP work that they've done for us, a lot of contract work, a lot of these contracts with the universities that we entered into and that we're entering into with companies are very unique. And so that takes a lot of legal time, and having them involved has been key. As I mentioned, the Boston Consulting Group has done a couple of pro bono cases for us. And we've just had, across the board in a lot of ways, people just step up and do things for us. And so we really try to leverage every dollar that we do raise to its maximum degree. But raising money from donors is very different from raising investment capital. It's really, because there can be no return to those donors from IRS guidelines, obviously. So it's really a psychic return. And so again, our donors are there because they really see this as something which is going to benefit people in a huge way, whether it's for the model or for the MS patients.
On this show, I usually ask people, where do you get your passion? But I wouldn't ask you that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I get my passion, I think, because I think that this literally is a game changer. And I think I like innovation. And I think if you look at our donors, they're almost all people who have built businesses in their own industries that have changed the game in that industry. And so they see what we're doing as something which has just huge implications. And I think that's what makes me passionate. I think that if you talk to any of the people involved with the Myelin Repair Foundation, we're all drinking the Kool-Aid. I mean, we are convinced that we are going to change the world, that this has huge implications. And so that's really fun when you're doing something like that. It's fun because it's challenging to be solving difficult problems, and I think it draws really smart people, because smart people like to solve big problems, and so it's really been fun to work with all the folks involved, whether they're on our staff, whether they're in the academics that we're working with, or whether they're in companies we're working with, or whether they're donors too. I mean, our donors are folks that have been very successful and have great ideas for ways that we can solve some of the problems we face. And we try and tap into that.
Thank you. We're talking with Scott Johnson he's the founder and the president of the Myelin Repair Foundation. Thanks again.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Today's show is sponsored by Collaborative Drug Discovery, leading the paradigm shift in collaborative web-based drug discovery research. Archive, mine, and collaborate around your lab's data with a hosted CDD vault. Make drug discovery fun again.